I'll be covering the reporting standards for new beans and refried beans today. Again, the important caveat here is each state still has their own requirements for compliance. This is intended to be more of a reporting process so that we're getting consistent results among the states for the same BMPs, but each state still retains their own compliance standards. So you need to check to make sure that you're complying with the state standards. As Tom stated earlier, and Norm as well, in the last 5 years, most of the states have updated their regulations, and most of us are moving towards this runoff reduction approach as opposed to what we've done in the past, mainly through stormwater treatment practices. This is just a slide that illustrates the various criteria that the states are using, as well as the different storm events. So as you can imagine, this posed quite a challenge to the expert panel, how to come to some type of a common process when you have all this variability in the compliance criteria. For the refried beans, kind of the same situation. I should point out that a late minute change for Delaware, we actually have a 30% reduction now for redevelopment. So that is a change to this slide, which I assume we can make available for download later. But again, a lot of variability. So how do we deal with this? One of the approaches that we agreed upon was to basically come up with an anchor rate. And the panel went back and reviewed a lot of the current literature on BMP performance and tried to develop a table of different classes of BMPs. And then adjuster curves were set for each of those classes. And where we arrived at was there were basically kind of, most of the BMPs fell into two general categories. One were the more traditional stormwater treatment practices, and then there's this newer generation of runoff reduction practices. We then kind of set up this type of a table. This is not all inclusive, but it gives you some idea of how the practices were categorized into treatment type practices and the newer runoff reduction practices. And we agreed that to be classified as a runoff reduction practices, you had to achieve at least a 25% reduction in the annual runoff volume. The way that this anchor rate was determined, the 1 inch of runoff was a fairly common criteria that was found in the literature. A lot of the basis of the results was based on an inch of runoff. That's kind of been one of the standards that has been used around the country for water quality purposes. So we determined that the average runoff reduction practice was able to achieve about a 70% reduction in both TP and TN. So that became the anchor rate for the runoff reduction practices. And for treatment practices, they fell in about an average of 55% for phosphorus and 35% for TN. So mapping those out on a chart like this, those kind of established the points that the adjuster curves would have to run through. So you can see basically at an inch of runoff, we set the removal efficiencies for the two types of practices at their respective rates. The next step was to develop the rest of the curve, and this was basically done following a rainfall frequency analysis, just running through the different amounts of runoff and adjusting the pollutant reductions based on the decrease in the runoff. So that two sets of curves were created for the stormwater treatment practices and the runoff reduction practices. So, for example, if a state had a criteria of managing a ½ inch of runoff, you could read up from the curve at the ½ inch runoff to runoff reduction. You could see you were getting 52% phosphorus removal credit at that level. Now, it's kind of tempting to compare rainfall depths, but that can be misleading since every state, again, has kind of a unique process for developing their hydrologic baseline. Some folks use the curve number approach, others use an annual runoff factor. But the results for each state can be categorized through what we ended up calling an engineering parameter. So that became the basis for this unitization approach that was endorsed by the panel. Again, each state kind of has their own compliance spreadsheets that they use. So by taking that result from the different states and defining it as this engineering parameter, that basically was the only variable in the equation that we came up with for new practices. And this is the equation that's used for that, and the IA represents the impervious area that's added for a new site. If we use an example in using Pennsylvania's criteria, this is a low-density residential example, 25-acre site on half-acre lots. Pre-development conditions were 50% forest, 50% meadow, all on sea soils. And in the post-developed condition, it's 25% impervious, 50% turf, and 25% forest, sorry. For this particular example, we're going to show a mix of runoff reduction practices. When you work through Pennsylvania's spreadsheet, the engineering parameter comes out to 1.16 acre feet. So plugging that into the equation, you come up with the reduction of 2.23 inches of runoff being reduced. So by going into these charts for the various pollutants, there's a separate chart for phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediment. And each one of those charts has different values on them. So if you go up at that 2.23 inches, I think it was, on these various charts, you'll come up with a TP removal of 82%, TN of 70%, and TSS of 88%. So that's what would be plugged into the model if Pennsylvania were to report runoff reduction practices on a site like that. Using a commercial retail project in Virginia, using Virginia's criteria, this is a 10-acre site. Pre-development condition was 100% meadow. For post-development, it's 80% impervious and 20% turf. Now, in this case, we'll use an example showing treatment practices. Working through Virginia's process, you come up with an engineering parameter of 0.67 acre feet. So applying that to the equation for a treatment practice, and again, your removals are going to be lower in this case because we're talking about treatment practices. You come up with TP 52%, nitrogen 33%, and sediment 66%. Okay, moving on to redevelopment. We determined that in this case we would look at untreated impervious cover, and the states are moving toward more stringent redevelopment requirements, although it does differ across the states. It applies to new redevelopment projects that meet the new redevelopment standards from 2010 and beyond. This requires that designers confirm the project is properly classified as redevelopment, and we're reporting impervious cover acreage treated. Now, the equation's a little bit different for redevelopment. In this case, we thought it would make more sense to use the actual site area as the basis for the equation. But the engineering parameter is the same. So this time we'll use DC as the example, use their engineering parameter for a redevelopment project. And in this example, it's a 2-acre site with 50% impervious and 50% turf in both the pre-developed and the post-developed, and it's on D soils. So in this example, we use the runoff reduction practices curve. When you take Virginia's criteria, they come out with the engineering parameter is 0.12 acre-feet. Plugging that back into the equation comes out to 0.72 inches being treated. You run that through the charts for runoff reduction, and you get 59% TP reduction, 51% TN, and 63% TSS. Now, granted, a lot of this seems like a minor improvement, but just as these impacts were incremental, hopefully by going back and addressing these redevelopment projects, we'll get some kind of incremental increase in water quality as well. So it's not going to happen overnight. As far as the basic reporting unit, the number of treated acres that fully meets the state standard is what's being reported, what needs to be reported. It was set up so that the typical duration of the removal rates is about twice what the MS4 inspection cycle is of 3 to 5 years. That removal rate can be extended based on field verification of performance. So a state can continue to take these kind of reductions, but there's a requirement that some type of an inspection process verifies that they are in fact still functioning properly. It's not necessary to report the baseline load. That's automatically calculated in the model itself. So the way the process has been set up, the localities only need to report the removal rate from the curves and the total treated acres for each project. Non-conforming projects. Now, obviously, we have a lot of beans in this jar here already, so those are considered non-conforming at this point, since most of the states have not adopted these newer standards. So there's a couple options that the states could use. They could go through the same process. For the most part, most of the BMPs in place now are probably the treatment type practices, although there may be some runoff reduction as well. So they can go through that process. If they don't want to go through that process, then they're kind of stuck with the default values in the model itself. So it's kind of at their option whether they want to go through the process of verifying their historic type BMPs.